Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait a few seconds before we start to let all the folks who are in the waiting room come into the session. That always takes a little bit of time to do that. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is roundtable discussion number 5, as you can see, and we are delighted to have you with us here today. And Paige, if you would advance to the next slide for me, please. Thank you. My name is Joanne Rife Snyder, and as the slide says, I'm a faculty at the University of Maryland School of Nursing. And prior to that, for 10 years, I was the Chief Nursing Officer at Genesis Healthcare. It is my privilege to be working with Erin Vignay, who is with AMDA and has selected as her project through an AHA fellowship, this More of a Good Thing. So if you're joining us for the first time and haven't been at any of the previous roundtables, I think you're really going to enjoy this. And I'm going to tell you on the next slide what the basis is for this. So what Erin decided to do, and I think was really quite brilliant, was to take the 4 M's that are being widely disseminated as age-friendly health systems through acute care, post-acute care, ambulatory care, really across all settings where care is delivered. And she said, what would this mean if we took these 4 key ingredients, if you will, and applied them to our care force, to staff who are probably in a more difficult place in post-acute care than we've ever had in the past in the wake of COVID, which of course is still not over. And each time I speak with leaders and staff in nursing homes and hear about new outbreaks, they're still dealing with it. So applied to our care force, as we're calling staff, what matters is the facility culture, being respected, having a voice. Medication, we've taken and modified a bit to really focus on health promotion and workplace safety. Mentation relates to well-being of staff with a focus on stress management and compassionate self-care. And today we're going to focus on that. And then last, mobility. We really interpret it as being mobile within your work setting, up, down, side to side, however, whichever way you might want to go. So it's opportunities for personal growth and career advancement. Next slide, please. Thanks. So these are the topics that we've covered already. These are available on the website if you are interested in hearing any of these recordings, with the exception of the Schwartz Center rounds, which was a closed session just for the folks who were there. Everybody was invited, but what happens in the room during Schwartz rounds stays in that room. So that's why that one isn't published. And in September, we'll be focusing on developing leaders. Next slide, please. So these are the guiding principles for the work that we're doing. We are together a community that is focused on co-design of the future. And we're taking the insights from these roundtable discussions, publishing them, and we'll be talking about ways that we will continue to build on and disseminate this work after this series completes. We take an all teach, all learn approach, and that's directly from Project ECHO. Many of you are familiar with that, I'm sure. Small tests of change, a rapid cycle quality improvement approach, certainly central to the Institute for Healthcare Improvement and work that they do, as well as many of you use that as well. And then, as I said, collation and dissemination of insights in various ways. Next slide, please. So I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Nancy Kuzmal, who is with us today, and Paige Hector, who will be addressing today's content. I do want to tell you a little bit about them. To begin with, Nancy is an associate professor in the baccalaureate social work program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She received her PhD from the University at Buffalo and her master's in social work from the University of Michigan. She was a nursing home social worker for more than a decade. Her research focuses on organizational culture, trauma-informed care, and the impact of trauma experiences on workers and care recipients. And she's especially interested in direct care workers, such as certified nursing assistants in nursing homes. She's co-chair of NASW Maryland Committee on Aging and is a fellow of GSA. She was also a 2019-2020 Health and Aging Policy Fellow and has done several podcasts on aging, trauma, and nursing homes on various platforms. We also have with us today Paige Hector, who is a national speaker, author, and clinical educator with over 25 years experience in post-acute and long-term care settings. She specializes in diverse topics for the IDT and sustainable process improvement. Paige writes extensively on topics relevant to nursing homes, including multiple chapters of Managing the Long-Term Care Facility, the second edition, which is due for publication in 2022. She is the associate editor and a regular columnist for Caring for the Ages, which, as you all know, is a publication for AMDA. And she's actively involved in the AMDA Online Education Subcommittee, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Work Group, and the Behavioral Health Advisory Council, as well as national work groups to improve trauma-informed care in post-acute and long-term care. And in 2018, she was named the Gerontologist of the Year for the Arizona Geriatric Society. So we are delighted to have these two highly qualified, well-known speakers with us today. Nancy and Paige, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joanne. And hello, everybody, friends and colleagues. So we are going to zip through a lot of information today. So Nancy and I are both passionate about trauma-informed care, and this is going to be focused on staff. And just to quickly lay a little bit of groundwork for you, you know, we talk about PTSD, and I also want to just hold space that we also would need to consider post-traumatic stress, not necessarily the disorder. But look at that first number right there, that over 1 in 4 people that work in healthcare are going to have some version of PTSD following a pandemic. So what we're talking about today is a serious public health, very serious public health concern. So we've taken a ton of information and kind of distilled it into some of the main points that we want to express to you today on this webinar. We need to define trauma. I've highlighted in red some of the content that I find particularly helpful. The trauma, it's an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. So it's not just a one and done type of thing. It can go across a long period of time, physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And there's usually some adverse effects on the functioning. I'll just point out that CMS does use this definition of trauma. There's emotional and psychological trauma resulting from extraordinarily stressful events. So just right there, those 3 words, right? We're talking pandemic. Shattering our sense of security. There's evidence of helplessness, situations that leave us feeling overwhelmed and isolated. And the more of those emotions that we have, the more likely that we are to experience traumatization. One of the key points of trauma is that it is an injury. It is not a weakness. It's not an illness or a character flaw. It is actually an illness or an injury. And what we're doing is shifting a perspective, a lens, if you will, from what's wrong with an individual to what has happened. So we're looking more at a global perspective of what has happened within your environment, and then how does that affect you individually. So a couple more terminology here, a couple more terms, triggers and re-traumatization. So triggers are anything that make us think, it basically is our brain telling us we are back in that state of trauma when the event actually happened, which is what re-traumatization is. So the more formal definitions are on there, but I want to quickly jump to this slide. It's one of my favorite slides, that when we are experiencing extreme stress or a traumatic reaction or re-experience, what happens is that we go into the limbic brain. So we're in the fight, flight, and freeze part of our brain. What that means is our prefrontal cortex, our PFC, is what we call offline. So all the reasoning, the judgment, the ability to be present with emotions and insight and empathy, all of that goes offline while our brain is saying, alert, alert, there's something going on, you've got to beware. I recently was reading a book I took this just spoke to me, that stress and trauma responses can also be connected to obviously a physical location. So I think about our nursing homes where so many people experience grief and death and loss. but it's also things like the tone of someone's voice, feelings of social rejection, even a mere hint of disapproval, worrying, constant worrying, and emotional reactions like if you're feeling trapped, anticipating rejection, or having any kind of doubts, all of those can actually stimulate our stress response. So on this slide, we see some of the things that you may have had said to you, or perhaps some of us have said these to other people. And the purpose here is not to shame or criticize anyone. It's simply to hold the truth that socially, we need to be doing a little bit more to become more trauma informed, to become more able to recognize and step forward with empathy rather than content like this, which actually creates distance with another person. So these things that we usually say to one another are out of good intention. The problem is that the impact on the other person, it's really difficult to receive these messages when what we're feeling inside might be extreme fear, anxiety, anger, frustration, nervousness, boredom, or apathy. So there's so many things going on underneath that these statements really don't, there's a disconnect there. When those things happen, of course, our biology picks fight, flight, or freeze. So fight is our anger, defensiveness, the blame, criticism, judgment. Your flight is more of your anxiety, avoidance, drug and alcohol use to kind of just get away from things, escape. And your freeze is when we really disconnect. We might be physically present, but we're not functioning, right? We're disconnected, not very good at identifying needs and feelings, and we have a flat affect. What happens when one of those three things are triggered? I want to introduce you to the concept of the line of choice. So below the line of choice, we have what we call reaction. So when we are, and I'm going to just bring these up real quickly, when we are stimulated, when we are triggered, what happens is that below the line of choice, we are immobilized with the freeze response, or we are mobilized with fight or flight. So all of those sample emotions at the bottom, when those are what are present, what are alive for us in that moment, we tend to we tend to react. We blame, we criticize, we judge, we come with words or actions that we may not typically come forward with when we are triggered. What we try to do is I talk with a lot about people. Are we below the line of choice or are we above the line of choice? So when we're above the line of choice, we're more in control. Our prefrontal cortex is in charge and we can respond. That's when we see the engagement and connection, when what our message is in alignment with how it's received. So when we have staff that are stressed and frustrated and irritable and angry and frightened and overwhelmed and discouraged, we need to be very mindful of how is it we are feeling and how might the other person be feeling, and are we above or below the line? You know, we're doing so many things. This was a result. I was at a meeting, I don't know, a year ago, maybe here in Arizona, and they were talking about all the different things that they're doing to help support staff. I won't read this slide, but these were some of the samples of things I heard. I don't necessarily disagree with these, but we need to go way beyond this stuff, folks. We've got to, in my mind, the way I see it, infuse compassion and empathy and trauma-informed care. If you are not familiar with this work, these are some statistics and quotations from, I'm going to switch to the next slide, this particular book. It's one of those must-reads in my mind. If you're not into reading in books, no worries. There is a webinar or a podcast, a TED Talk on it. So have 40 seconds of compassion could save a life. Basically, the idea that there's science and the art of medicine. So these two physicians bring those together and they call it compassionomics. It's very powerful and quite moving. So quickly, what is trauma-informed care? The definition is the adoption of principles and practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. And if I could just sit for one moment with this content right here, there is so much going on in that one sentence, the adoption of principles and practices. So when we think about trauma-informed care in our nursing homes, we obviously associate it, and having just received the phase 3 guidance, how do we do this for our residents and patients? And what I want to do is I want to back it up, because my belief, though, again, the way I see it, I know a lot of my colleagues do as well, is that we cannot do these things for our residents and patients if we as staff don't feel these things as well. If we do not feel safe and secure and well cared for in the environments where we work, it's really difficult to turn around and do that for our residents, the people we take care of. So just really quickly here, 6 principles of trauma-informed care. I want to land, we're going to talk for just a moment here about this one, safety. It's one of the top 2. I think safety, trust, and transparency, for me, those are really the 2 at the top. All of these are critically important, but I want to focus on safety for a moment. If any of you are familiar with the sanctuary model, Sandra Bloom is the founder of that model. I was reading a piece by her recently, and she says that a physically safe environment, although necessary, obviously we need physical safety at work, of course we do, it was not sufficient. There had to be other kinds of safety, which she termed psychological safety, social safety, and moral safety. And my gosh, when I read those words, I was like, oh, that's it. It just resonated with me. Social safety refers to the ability to be part of a group, to listen and be heard, and to play a role in the conflict resolution. Basically, it's our ability. And if we think about why do we go to work, what is our purpose? We want to serve and connect and be part of something bigger than ourselves. That's the social safety component. The moral safety is talking about an environment actively defining and redefining moral universe that includes integrity, responsibility, and honesty, and tolerance, and compassion, and nonviolence. All of these things that I think of healthcare as, and this is the epitome of who we are, that we want to come into the world, into our workplaces, and know that we're working in an environment that allows us to step forward with our values around moral safety. So with that, that's a really quick run through. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Nancy, and we're going to stop share. And Nancy, it should go for you to share.
I started sharing before I unmuted, so that was the problem. So thank you, everybody. I know we've gone through a lot already so very quickly, so I want to take a moment to sort of frame it, that we are talking about these common experiences that people who work in healthcare have had, particularly over the last 2 years. We're talking about the environments and the culture of the organization, and we're also talking about ways that this culture helps individuals cope with this stress and trauma from the last couple of years, but also how together we can go through these very human processes. So for example, grieving. The mourning and grieving, that I let myself feel grief in response to the loss of something that matters to me. And what losses have people experienced in healthcare over the last 2 years? Losses of individuals, but also that loss of the sense of safety. And as staffing has become shorter, as there's been added stress and added things to do, how can we increase the capacity of the facility culture to support staff in general, and then also to support staff to mourn and to grieve those experiences that they have had. And Paige, I see something has come in on the chat. It's hard for me to look at the chat while I'm screen sharing. So if you can keep an eye on the chat, that would be great.
It's just me, Nancy,
Okay.
Sending a message to everyone, but we'll handle it. You don't have to watch the chat.
Okay. So what are we mourning? What are we mourning individually, and what are we mourning as healthcare workers? Deaths, illnesses in our personal communities, in our larger communities, and in the healthcare communities in which we work. This loss of the sense of normalcy, or the processes as we understand them. I think about this as an academic now, and as a parent going back into the school year, when we're again revisiting for the 49th time what our COVID procedures are going to look like, who is doing what. If we've been mourning this normalcy on an ongoing basis over the last 2 years, and certainly in healthcare, we've had this loss of predictability, a sense of safety, and then within that, a sense of purpose and trust and respect. We went from healthcare heroes Though I would argue that in long-term care, there was also that blaming, but that's another story. From the healthcare heroes to now being, to not having that understanding. And people are questioning their desire to stay in healthcare and thinking about what could we do differently. And as a healthcare culture, we have this just get over it idea. We don't have time to pause and reflect and process because there is this continued sense of needing to move forward. And so we need to disrupt that status quo. How do we change the culture by disrupting the status quo? Even just, and this was an issue, I would say, before COVID, where staff, team members were not given time and space to mourn, to grieve when somebody passed away, somebody that maybe they cared for 2, 3, 4 years. The bed had to be turned around because we had to have a new admission. We had to keep the census up. This book has a quote: "Do you know how it feels to have known and loved a resident for years and then be off for a couple of days and come back and find out that the person has died? No one called me. I just have to go back to work and pretend that everything is okay." And this is damaging. And in some ways, our institutional culture has been damaging well before we then had to come deal with this global pandemic. And caveat to say, we know that staff shortages are an issue. We know that this is challenging. And so the way we break that cycle is that we change the culture, is that we make sure that we support the staff we do have, or else we end up continuing the cycle of burning people out and people leaving. Staff might not feel, going back to those principles that Paige mentioned of safety, staff might not feel safe to express grief openly. They might feel pressure to deal with it or to just move on. There's probably not a formal structure in place to support staff. Is there, how does the nursing home address the larger room when somebody passes away? Is there a public acknowledgement? Is there a place for people to gather and remember? Or does it get swept under the rug as we turn over the room for the next person? I think in the larger culture, we don't necessarily like talking about death. And so we often use language that makes people feel unsafe, makes people feel like they can't talk about their grief. They change the subject. They, look at it this way. I think you should. Even when loved ones die, we talk about them being in a better place, which really doesn't give people the space to sit and experience that grief and mourning. We tend to think that grief shrinks over time, but the reality is we grow around our grief. The container that we hold our grief in expands, and so the grief does feel smaller. And so how can we stay, death is a part of life. That's something that I certainly learned in my years in long-term care. And so how do we acknowledge that death is a part of life and yet affirm that mourning and affirm that grieving process? Name the loss, surrender to the yearning, process in community. As humans, we have a need to tell our story. We have a need to be with others. And so how do we create spaces for our staff to have community, to be able to process this together? One of the principles of trauma-informed care was that peer support. And how does good peer support make somebody feel safer? Physical safety, emotional safety, all of those safeties that Paige mentioned earlier. We don't have to be therapists to be therapeutic. We have to be able to communicate with each other and foster environments where people can communicate with each other. How do we provide safe and constructive spaces that don't necessarily deteriorate into the stereotypical bitch sessions, but that allows people to feel heard and not blamed, and supporting staff so they don't feel alone. When we can create understanding and connection, yeah, something shifts, physically shifts. When somebody feels like they're understood, there's a sense of relief. And so now we're going to switch into well, what can you do about it? How can we incorporate this into our long-term care facilities? And our recommendation would be to assess the staff perceptions of the organization. Find out how they're feeling. When we talk about trauma-informed care, Paige and I have found that a lot of times people say, well, we're already doing this, and I think it's important to say, we're not saying you're not doing these things. It's important to check in though, and see how other staff feel like you're doing. It may feel different depending on your positionality. As a leader, you may feel more safety than maybe a frontline staff member does. And so we need to figure out how people at all levels are experiencing the nursing home. So the the resource that we're going to introduce is the Trauma-Informed Climate Scale, the TIC-10. There is a longer 34 question version, but we have, I was involved with the team that did the research to bring this down to a 10 question scale, and the links will be in the slides that Amanda will share with you. And this is a quick way to screen how staff is feeling about the trauma-informed care environment in the nursing home. And this is trauma-informed care for staff, not for residents. So it's things like having choices in doing their jobs, whether the leaders listen to them, opportunities to gain skills and things like that. And we think it's really important that this doesn't become the flavor of the month, that, okay, we're going to give you a survey and then we're not going to do anything with it. And that will actually have the reverse effect, that you'll decrease trust with staff if you ask them to do this and then do nothing with the results. Trauma-informed care is not a destination. It is a journey. It is doing better today. It's doing better every day than you did the day before. And so that involves assessing where you are. The TIC-10 measures the extent to which employee rights, freedoms, and contributions are valued. And these values can contribute to the overall success of the agency. And again, reduces people feeling burned out, reduces people leaving, all of that. Think about what you would do if a majority of the staff don't believe that the organization cares about staff, whether staff gets what they want to do their job well. What would you do if a staff says they don't know how they stand with administration? And so thinking about what kinds of actions you can take to address those. How could you build in time and space for peer support and debriefing? Time is often the biggest commodity that people feel like they don't have. And so how can that be built in? Wanting to debrief is natural. Turning to others for support is natural. The problem is we don't do it well. We often have sort of a brain dump of debriefing, and we don't think about the impact of the story we're telling on other people. So what do you want from telling a story? Do you let the other person know that it might be something upsetting that you're going to share? Acknowledging the recipient's response. If they aren't able to hear it, accepting that as a response, and thinking about how much to share. So what we'll ask you to do is think about next steps, what you could do. We're going to stop sharing at this point, the slides at this point, and hopefully have a conversation where we can think about some of those next steps. But if you're not comfortable with sharing out loud and you want to put something in the chat, please feel free to put something there and we'll be happy to talk about those. So I am going to stop sharing my screen at this point and we'll open it up for discussion.
Great. Paige and Nancy, thank you so much. This was the chat that you couldn't follow, Nancy, because you were speaking, contains accolades for this wonderful content. Thank you both so much. It's a lot to absorb, but this group of folks you have before you today have been living this, right along with you in these last couple of years. And I know, they're anxious to discuss. I see Amy Berman has her hand up. Hi, Amy. You have a question?
Hi, Joanne. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Paige. This was a fantastic presentation. And I love, this discussion for the staff and really for any human being. I think that it's just a terrific conversation. I'm just wondering, right now in social media, there was just a CEO who cried as he laid off his workforce, and it's kind of buzzing around the ether. And, what it basically said was, it talked about the changing views on emotion in the workplace and emotion in leadership. And, so when you're creating an environment where you are allowing people to grieve, where you're recognizing trauma, where you're giving them time and space, what's the role of leadership in modeling that?
Thanks,
Amy. Yeah, I'll start off with that one. What a great question, Amy. Couple things with that. I love that that's happening. I want to point out that we have this idea that we've been socially habituated into thinking that any type of emotion, first of all, is a feminine thing, right? I happen to be reading a book called, I'll just share it with you, Rage Becomes Her. Talking about how so often we associate any type of emotion as a feminine thing. We've got to stop doing that. Human beings emotionally, we're meant to have all sorts of a wider range of emotions. So the fact that this is happening with this particular CEO, first of all, that speaks to me about vulnerability, which is amazing. The more that we can be vulnerable and tell people and show people that we are vulnerable people as leaders, as adults, there has to be some level, I like to think of it, the transparency of that as well, because when we can lead by role modeling, what that tells the staff and the greater community is that, it is okay. It is okay to cry. It is okay to say, this really hurts. I'm hurting right now. To name it, and I love naming it. I want to disrupt the social order that says that we cannot do these things. So I think that's what's happening. So to me, it also speaks about the nonviolent communication approach to all of this, that we need to be able to show some empathy and to have some tenderness around these are human beings and the lives and the impact that it's had on all of us. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Before we go on to Nancy's hand, I just wanted to take a quick response to Kristen's inquiry in the chat, because I think it fits with what Paige was just saying. I think it's rather than respond, Paige asked, or Kristen asked about the responses that we had up there, about responses to mourning. And I think it's a matter of sitting with it and allowing somebody to be upset, saying, I'm sorry you're hurting. What can I do to help? As opposed to telling somebody how they should fix it. That make sense?
Yeah, that's great, Nancy. Thank you. Thanks for taking Kristen's question. I think that was a good one. And I think what I'm hearing you both say is that let's not try to just fill in the space with words that could actually be hurtful, but to really sit and listen first before we speak. Nancy, you had your hand
Thank
up.
you. I have long believed that there's been some disconnect between wanting our care force to respond with care and empathy and not treating them that same way. So thank you for raising these issues. I think they're critically important. But I'm just going to challenge something that Paige just said. The care force in long-term care is predominantly female. I think it's okay that we show that the reason why this belongs in long-term care and why the softer side, as we would say, belongs here is because this is the workforce. And we bring caring better. I don't mean clinical caring. I mean, we bring the emotional caring piece of it. It's in our DNA. We're the nurturers. And so I'm less afraid of having that be front and center and worried about it being seen as being, well, that's, you know, the women's reaction to it, and proudly saying that's our reaction to it because we're women. And this is the work we've chosen to do, and we do it well. So I look at it from both sides. I wouldn't apologize for the fact that we bring emotion to the work that we do.
Nancy, just to tee up, and thank you for pointing that out. I want to support in what you just said, that's exactly what I was actually saying too, is to own and say this is what's happening, and to name it publicly, and to stand with it, even when it is a little bit uncomfortable, either as the person having the emotion or the people in the room viewing that emotion. So totally on board with you with that. So cool.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks for that response.
I'll just jump in quickly. Andrea, heartfelt, love it. I think to me, it all comes back to my direction right now is really going towards cultivating skills around nonviolent communication. I put something about that in the chat, stepping into it with empathy, identifying what is it we're feeling and needing. And that opens up a bigger dialogue, and it actually names the human experience. To me, we can't move on really to strategies and what to do next until we really acknowledge where we are. And I think that we think that we're doing that sometimes. And the way I see it is that we are not yet, because we tend to want to jump to the advice, getting the reassurance, the strategies, what do we do next, and the next policy, the next regulation. And I just feel like we need to slow it down and kind of be where we are for just a little while.
Yeah, thank you, Paige. Nancy, I want to give you a moment. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
You know, I tend to think sort of practically, you know, can we build 10 minutes into a shift change? Can we, you know, where can we put those little pockets of time to just, as Paige said, give people time to breathe? And I think some of that also comes from valuing relationships and valuing time spent with residents over the checklist of things that they have to do.
Yeah.
Or at least equally with that checklist of things they have to do.
Great, thank you. Lee, did you have a question?
Yeah, question/comment.
Mhm.
You know, I think first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with absolutely everything that's been said here. And I think that, you know, thinking about our staff it almost feels traumatizing to me as a leader, like emotionally traumatizing for what the staff in the facilities are going through. And I think that just to sort of add to what Nancy was saying, in addition to staff being, you know, our staff being primarily women, and, you know, what happens to them in the building, they're also primarily low wage workers. And, you know, we don't know what kind of burdens and staff and trauma that may be creating for them at home. So I think that a lot of this is probably, you know, compounded problem, in addition to coming into the building, and the emotional and physical stress of their jobs is tremendous. So it's, you know, I was reading an article not too long ago, and it just said, like, remember to, like, if you feel like you're going to react with emotion, stop and count to 5. And, you know, like, even something as simple as just taking a beat and can redirect your energies before you respond to somebody. The other thing that this conversation has made me think about is how I don't know that, or I am sure that long-term care does not have enough positive media attention. I've never read a positive article about the long-term care industry. And there are so many people that are working so hard and doing such good work. And I just think that that adds to the stress and the burden. And, you know, is, you know, how do we turn that around as a group and as an industry?
Thanks, Lee. Any comments from Paige or Nancy or anyone else? it seems like the theme that I'm hearing is that there's just a lot of churn going on, and there are no simple ways, ahead, although there certainly are many, many initiatives underway. The John A. Hartford Foundation is certainly contributing to that work and leading many of those. But Nancy and Paige, do you have anything that you'd like to say as sort of final comments around this session and sort of these broader issues of how do we just move forward?
I do want to say one quick last thing, but also want to respond to Lee a little bit. You cannot expect the staff to be trauma informed for residents if we're not trauma informed for the staff, period. And Lee, I think it feels huge. And I think the most important thing to do is figure out what that one little thing is. What first step can you take to help the nursing home that you're closest to do better tomorrow than they do today? And we recommend taking that staff pulse, but what other things, one little thing, and if we're just add one little thing at a time, then we can start that ball rolling down the hill and get that change, that bigger change coming.
Right. So start somewhere, just start, right? It sounds like you're saying. And Paige, I'll give you the final word.
Just closing, just to reiterate, I think what you guys have all said, to start somewhere, focus on one thing. I have an idea of the flavor of the month, and I tried so hard to move us away from that we do this month, this next month kind of thing. I really am interested in finding ways that we can ground into our changes together, that we do them quickly, but we kind of accumulate the ones that are working and continue to do those. And I think that's where, as leaders, the changes, it's really difficult to keep that motivation, to keep that momentum going, and sustainability. So I think, talking to me, I'm very transparent. I love to talk with staff. What do you guys think? How is it working for you? Please tell me when it's not working. What does it look like when it's good? And just the feedback and the interaction, and truly make it my language, because Lee, you named it, the power with, right? Where we have so much power over in medicine, and a hierarchical approach, the traditional medical model is power overing people. And then we have people that are power under. I want power with. Any way that I can seek to have power with another human being, no matter who they are, where they're from, or what job they do, that to me is a good day. I've made some progress.
I like that. That's wonderful. I'm sorry that we have to end. I think we could have easily talked for much longer about this, as has been true with most sessions, if not all. Thank you all for attending today. Paige and Nancy, thank you so much for what you brought to this conversation today. We're really grateful. I believe your slides will be available. Is that right? That Aaron will be able to post those. And thanks to each one of you for engaging today in this conversation. And we'll see you on September 22nd, I hope. Bye-bye now.